Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Shovel Knight Plague of Shadows. In the last part we started off the game, now we're heading off to Pridemore Keep because it really is just the best first main level. So at the end of the last part, we got the bait bomb for Plague Knight, which is his first proper sub-weapon. And it works just like Shovel Knight's fishing rod. You use it at sparkly pits, you can get like a goldfish that's worth 350 gold. Sometimes, most of the time you'll actually get a single health tonic, sometimes you get a lyric sheet, or no, a music sheet rather. It's the same thing as the fishing rod overall. But you may have noticed on the top left that we don't have a number with a blue jar next to it like Shovel Knight did for sub-weapon use. We just have a power meter that you can even upgrade. Plague Knight's sub-weapons, which are known as Arcanum, are closer in general to magic spells with a recharging meter than they are a limited resource. The blue mana jars can still replenish your power gauge, but even if you run out of it, it does still replenish over time, thankfully. Closer to just a recovering MP gauge, I guess. With that said, different sub-weapons do take up a different amount of power, and that's why you want to focus on getting the Arcana power upgrades from the Magicist as soon as you can, so you have as many options for using, or many opportunities to use your sub-weapons as you can. With that said, his sub-weapons are definitely of a different variety, but we'll talk more about those when we get the first one later on in this stage. Speaking of this stage, Pridemore Keep, like with the Passage of Plains, or Plains of Passage rather, is by and large the exact same. There's going to be one new section in it, but the mechanics are still unchanged. The biggest mechanic you're going to be coming across is the lava pots that just pour down occasionally. There'll be those books down the line. In general, for a lot of the early Shovel Knight stages, it feels like if they don't have much in the way of stage mechanics, the enemies are the gimmick, because by and large, enemies are unique per stage. With that said, at the end of last part, we also bought our first upgrade at Mona, the Float Burst. The Float, when you buy a new burst, you change it either by going to the select menu or holding the R button and then pressing, I think, down to swap between your bursts, because you can swap between the different parts of your bomb upgrades by holding R and then pressing anything on the D-pad. The Float Burst is my preferred burst throughout the game, because what it does, when you do a charge burst, or a bomb burst like that, you don't just rocket off in a direction, you also slowly descend to the ground after you reach your peak height. I find this a lot more comfortable to use than basically any other burst in the game for stage exploration on a first run through, because the slow descent makes getting over long distances or carefully controlling yourself over bottomless pits a lot more comfortable, and given how much of Plague Knight's level design is reliant on new bottomless pits or instant kill spikes, or just is Shovel Knight's level design with a few twists, it's pretty comfortable to use. It's not the best for combat, but you could argue from the start that the starting burst is best for that. We'll get into the other things we could buy at Mona's shop in a moment, though, because we got an important chest over here. Within this is the Flare Wand, a worthless relic. Maybe someone else would want this rubbish. In every single one of Plague Knight's stages, you can find the sub-weapons that Shovel Knight himself would get in his own campaign. But you can't do anything with them outright. We need to find someone else who can take advantage of them. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. For now, let's go back to talking about the bombs. So at the start of the game, you can only buy a certain amount of upgrades from Mona. The more Cypher Coins you get, as we showed off last time, you can get more and more. The bomb upgrades are split into 4 categories: fuses, powders, casings, and bursts. Bursts, as we showed off here, change what happens when you charge up your bomb and then release it. Casings tend to alter the trajectory of bombs. Powder alters the explosions of the bombs, and at times how many bombs you can have active at a time, because you can only have 3 to start, for instance. Whereas powders change how the bombs themselves detonate. At the start of the game here, we have the bounce casing black powder and standard fuse, which means you can throw 3 bombs that bounce along the ground before causing a large explosion after a few moments. But at the start of the game, you can purchase the lob casing, the tracer and cascade powders, and the long fuse. We'll talk about those in a second, because if we come over to where we found the Flare Wand of Shovel Knight, we get that funny animation of Plague Knight forcing himself into the same hole. But we can even see the chest that we found the Flare Wand in. I wonder what's in it this time as Plague Knight. Ah! Poured in a beaker, stuffed in a bag, Chester's always got the swag. Hey, nice relic, pal. You know, I could take that off your hands and give you something a little more interesting. Chester serves as how we get our Arcana for Plague Knights because you trade them for your required relics that Shovel Knight would use. For instance, here we got the Big Boom, which is sort of a crossover of the Holy Water and the Axe from Castlevania. You throw it in an upwards arc, and it does a gigantic plus-shaped explosion after a long time or after it hits a certain type of block or enemy. Very useful. It basically does a full pip of damage on boss fights. I recommend it a lot for that. Now, in the case you didn't find Shovel Knight's relic within the stage, you can still get the Arcana from Chester, but you have to pay a certain amount of gold per. And that's why I said gold can be more important for Plague Knight, because I think they also cost more for Plague Knight than they did for Shovel Knight. With that said, since you can always find the relics to make them free, I recommend doing that. So, the upgrades for the bombs that you can buy at first for Plague Knight. The lob casing makes it so that you throw the bomb in an upward arc just like the Big Boom we just got, actually. And that can be pretty good against specific boss fights. The Tracer Powder makes it so that the explosion of the bomb will cause wall-climbing flames that can be extraordinarily useful against enemies that tend to cling to walls or to access the piles of dirt that are on walls. The Cascade Powder produces waves of fire in both directions that I think is slightly related to the Spark upgrade you can get for Shovel Knight's shovel in the last game, or in the main campaign, rather. Not exactly to my taste. The fuses, the long fuse is probably the most basic fuse in the game. It just increases the amount of time that the bombs will be on screen before they explode. And because of that, you can use it to reach enemies further away. Like I said last time, Plague Knight is overall the longest range of the 4 playable characters. So if you wanted to, you could just upgrade to like the long fuse and the lob casing or something and just stay far away from anything. And the important thing to note, and I don't really take good advantage of this, you should hold the R button in case you want to update your casings a lot. Because you can just change them at any time to fit whatever situation you're in. I tend to stick with one very particular setup in general, but that's because in my mentality, it's like I'm playing a Mega Man game. I stick with this one setup, and I don't tend to alter from it much. But you really should, because Plague Knight's arsenal by the end of the campaign, as long as you're collecting all the Sapphire coins to get all the upgrades, can befit basically any situation, because that he's overall probably the most malleable playstyle. Because Shovel Knight, you're almost always going to have to get close to key characters to do damage. Same with Spectre Knight. King Knight's entire deal is literally bonking into enemies. Plague Knight, you can adapt to anything, and I do appreciate that portion of this campaign. It's just that at times, I wish we had more original level design to work with. In fact, we saw earlier, the area where we found the Flare Wand is the only, I think, completely changed section of this level, because that wasn't in Shovel Knight's version of this at all. And that really becomes the trend for all of Plague Knight's stages. And if you look at it from the perspective of originally he was just an unlockable character campaign, it makes sense. But with what Spectre Knight and King Knight's campaigns came out to be, it definitely is a little, I guess, disappointing in retrospect. Now, if there's anything I can really admire about Shovel Knight overall, though, even with the unchanged level design for Plague Knight here, I really do appreciate how long all the levels are, because if you compare this to, say, like a Mega Man game, usually the levels in those games are like at max 8 minutes long, but basically every level in this game is about 15 to 20 minutes. And the weird thing is, very few of them feel like they drag on despite that. And I think what that comes down to is how often they introduce new enemies and mechanics in those stages. On top of having good interplay of mechanics from the stage. Like, usually, like, if you look at a Mega Man game, for instance, to go back to that comparison, which I know I do a lot, but it's my main series, so it's the thing I compare things to. Usually a stage in a Mega Man game will have, like, what, 1 or 2 unique mechanics tops. Because of the amount of unique enemies a stage can have on top of the unique hazards, by and large, I'd say an average Shovel Knight stage has, like, 8 or 9 unique mechanics to it that it can create interesting interplay with. Like, there's a few times where it feels like they don't take it to a full effect, but at the same time, you can also tell if you look at each of the campaigns that have unique level design. It really feels like they got better at designing levels as they made them. both within the individual campaigns and the extra campaigns, if that makes sense. Like, if you compare the stage design in Shovel Knight, Shovel of Hope, to Spectre of Torment, there's a definite quality difference in a good way. And it makes me really excited for what Mina the Hollower will be like, because I really do like Yacht Club as a development team. I think they're really smart about how they handle things. Also, here we got the returning book page mechanic. You hit the book, the page platforms show up and then disappear after a little bit. But while this hazard type is actually kind of nerve-wracking for Shovel Knight, Plague Knight's Bomb Burst, especially with the Float Burst equipped, kind of makes these hazard types a non-issue, because you can just ignore half the hazards. And I guess that is where sharing level design can be a little interesting in this case, because you can recontextualize how you play around things. But it still feels a little weird. By the way, since I forgot to mention it, I know I mentioned last time that the wings checkpoints are unbreakable, but that's because if you see a checkpoint in the game by and large and it doesn't have wings around it, you can break it for extra money. The problem with that is you're lacking a checkpoint. For instance, you can break this checkpoint right before King Knight coming up here, and if you die, you're then sent back to the nearest checkpoint and you hit, which can be quite the backtrack in some cases. Plague Knight, you double-crossing constable of crucibles! Having fun in your little kingdom? Oh, I'm sorry. I meant kingdom. Oh, this lavish lifestyle's in my blood, peon. Bask in the glimmering grace of a true monarch. As the embodiment of opulence, I demand tribute. Let's have that essence. I think I'll take the nice crown, too. King Knight here, in fact, most bosses as Plague Knight are relatively unchanged from their Shovel of Hope appearance. He bounces all over the place, doing some swipes across the screen and some downward strikes. His most threatening attack is probably his big charge across, or when he generates the horns that can rain confetti down that can damage you. Because he moves so slowly and stands still so long, he's a perfect starting boss for Plague Knight because you can just combo him like that. Also, whenever you beat a boss fight, photosensitivity warning, it gets kind of flashy whenever the essence happens. And unlike Shovel Knight, where you had to walk back to the village, you're warped immediately back to the Potionarium after a boss fight. Drop the essence into my dynamo decanter here. The essence are volatile, but my breakthrough design stabilizes them. Once the essences are all distilled together, if my research is correct, then we can craft the ultimate potion. King Knight's essence is ours, and I discovered that his crown isn't real gold. I knew it. Pretender indeed. Well, let's get down to business then. Now that we have enough Cypher Coins, we can also invest in our first research upgrade. Yep, that'll do it. Okay, stand back as I test my hypotheses. Take a gander at your new arsenal. So now we can buy several new pieces of equipment, and I'm immediately buying the component powder because it's by and large my favorite powder in the game. At least for my general play style. The amount of options that you have at any point in time in this game can be overwhelming if you aren't getting money quickly enough, admittedly. But because of how Toolkit Plague Knight's abilities can be at the same time, you don't have to worry about which order you go in by and large unless you have a definitive favorite. I also got myself the Secret Fuse there, which is another favorite of mine, even though I don't tend to use it throughout most of the game. The main thing here is I wanted to make sure I had enough gold to get the first Arcana bar upgrade. And that costs 3,000. So now we have a bar of 3 units instead of 2, and there's one more after that to get it to 4. Again, I recommend focusing on that as soon as you can, essentially. And if you die in a stage and have enough gold, I also recommend between stages restocking your health tonics up to max. Yeah, for right now you can only max out at 5, but it's worth to keep around all the same. But, like in Shovel of Hope, every now and then, knights will show up in the world map and occupy a space, like the Hammer Brothers and Super Mario Bros. 3. These range from being mini-bosses to being revisits to stage mechanics to get some extra gold, essentially. I'm doing all of these, not just because this is a 100% LP, barring feats. And I know I mentioned during Shovel Knight, Shovel of Hope, that I have Platinum Trophied Shovel of Hope. I have not done that for any of the other campaigns because there's just something less grabbing about getting a platinum trophy for these campaigns to me, and I can't exactly place why. If there was one I would do it for, it probably would be Spectre or Torment, but that's just because it's my favorite of the main expansions. These stages, when you get them, are also, as you can see, absurdly short. But with that, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we're gonna have to head after the next main stage, and the only stage left in this chunk of the world map, Spectre Knight. See you guys then.